The day had finally arrived, and it was everything Elizabeth had dreamed it would be. The sky was a brilliant blue, the sun casting a golden light over the garden where her wedding was set. Guests filled the rows of white chairs facing the beautifully decorated altar, their faces glowing with excitement. Elizabeth stood in the bridal suite, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her gown flowed around her in delicate waves of lace, her hair perfectly styled. She felt beautiful, she felt ready. Today, she would marry David, the man she loved, her millionaire fiancé who had swept her off her feet and promised her a future filled with love and adventure. As the wedding planner fluttered around her, making last-minute adjustments to her veil, Elizabeth glanced at the clock. They were running a few minutes behind schedule, but that wasn't unusual for a wedding of this size. A hint of nervousness flickered through her, but she quickly dismissed it, choosing to focus on the joy she felt. Yet something lingered. Her bridesmaids exchanged looks that she couldn't quite read. Elizabeth tried to catch her best friend's eye, but the woman quickly looked away, her face unusually pale. "What's going on?" Elizabeth asked, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. One of the wedding coordinators stepped into the room, looking flustered. "There's been a slight delay with the groom's arrival, but we're sorting it out." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. A delay with the groom? That's when the murmurs from outside began to creep in, the faint hum of worried whispers drifting through the walls. A cold chill ran down her spine, but she fought it. David wasn't the type to panic under pressure. He must have been caught up in some last-minute issue. He would arrive soon, she told herself. He always did. Minutes stretched on, and the energy in the room shifted. Elizabeth's mother appeared in the doorway, her face tight with concern. "Honey, no one can find David?" The words hit her like a slap. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "What do you mean no one can find him?" Her voice wavered as a knot tightened in her throat. The room seemed to tilt as the reality of her mother's words sunk in. David wasn't just late. He was missing. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed his number, praying it was all a misunderstanding. The phone rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. She tried again, her heart racing faster with each unanswered ring. The room grew quieter, the anxious faces of her bridesmaids and family hovering around her as if they were waiting for her to break. And she was close, so close. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking as her phone slipped from her grip, clattering onto the floor. The voices of the guests outside, still waiting, became louder, a reminder of the hundreds of eyes that would soon know the truth. David wasn't coming. The door to the bridal suite creaked open, and the wedding planner returned, her face grim. She gave a slight shake of her head, confirming what Elizabeth had already started to understand but couldn't yet accept. He wasn't just late. He wasn't going to show up at all. The weight of it crashed down on her. Elizabeth's vision blurred as tears stung her eyes. He had abandoned her. On what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, David had vanished without a word, leaving her alone, humiliated in front of their families, their friends, the world. The whispers from the guests turned into a low murmur as the news began to spread outside. Elizabeth could feel the walls closing in on her. Her chest tightened as panic and heartbreak collided inside her. She couldn't breathe. This was supposed to be her perfect day. It was supposed to be the beginning of the rest of her life, a life with David. But now, that future had shattered, and she was left standing alone, in a wedding dress meant for a dream that would never come true. In the weeks that followed, the shock of David's disappearance lingered like a cloud over Elizabeth's life. The news of her abandonment spread quickly, turning what should have been the most private heartbreak into a public spectacle. Everywhere she went, it seemed like people were whispering behind her back, wondering how she had been left at the altar by a man as rich and successful as David. But it wasn't the gossip or the stares that weighed her down the most. It was the silence from David. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no word from him. No explanations, no apologies. It was as if he had vanished completely, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life that had crumbled in an instant. Then, one morning, Elizabeth woke up feeling strangely unwell. At first, she chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. After all, her world had been turned upside down. But when the nausea persisted, something in the back of her mind began to stir. Her body felt different, heavier, in a way she couldn't quite explain. A trip to the doctor confirmed what Elizabeth hadn't dared to consider. She was pregnant. And not just with one child, with triplets. The news hit her like a tidal wave, bringing a new kind of shock that eclipsed even the pain of David's abandonment. She sat in the doctor's office, her hands resting protectively on her stomach, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. Pregnant, with triplets, and David was gone. The old Elizabeth might have crumbled under the weight of it all, but something inside her shifted. The moment she knew there were 3 lives growing inside her, a fierce determination took hold. She would raise these children on her own, and she would do it with strength and grace. She couldn't control what David had done, but she could control how she responded. She wouldn't let his betrayal define her or her children's future. The next few months were a blur of preparation and change. Elizabeth threw herself into creating a stable life for her future family. She moved out of the apartment she and David had shared, finding a smaller but cozy home where she could start fresh. She stopped looking at the news, stopped reading the stories about David's sudden disappearance from the business world, and focused entirely on the babies growing inside her. Though the pregnancy was physically and emotionally exhausting, Elizabeth found a renewed sense of purpose. Each ultrasound, each tiny flutter of movement from her children, reminded her that she wasn't alone. She had 3 reasons to keep going, 3 reasons to build a life filled with love and security. David's absence still hurt, but now it was a distant ache compared to the excitement and nervous anticipation of becoming a mother. She was no longer the abandoned bride. She was Elizabeth, a mother-to-be, and nothing could take that strength from her. 3 years had passed since the day Elizabeth's world had been turned upside down. In that time, she had transformed herself, not just in how she lived but in who she had become. Her life was no longer defined by the pain of being abandoned at the altar. Instead, it revolved around the joy and chaos of raising 3 beautiful children, her triplets, Emma, Noah, and Lucas. Her home, though smaller and more modest than the life she had once imagined, was filled with warmth. The walls were adorned with crayon drawings, and the sound of laughter echoed through the rooms. Elizabeth had thrown herself into motherhood, and despite the challenges of raising 3 young children on her own, she had never felt more fulfilled. Her days were busy, filled with balancing work and the endless needs of 3 toddlers, but there was a peace that came with it, a sense of purpose that kept her going. Financially, things weren't easy, but she had found a steady job working from home, giving her the flexibility to be present for her children. It wasn't the glamorous life she once pictured as David's wife, but it was real, and it was hers. The sting of David's abandonment had faded over time, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. There were moments, late at night when the house was quiet, that she would think of him, wondering why he had left, what had driven him away. But she never allowed herself to dwell on it for long. He was a ghost from her past, someone who no longer had a place in her life or in the lives of her children. For the most part, she had built a world where David didn't exist. She rarely thought about him, and she had shielded her children from the knowledge of his absence, not yet ready to explain why they didn't have a father. For now, they were happy, and that was all that mattered to her. Elizabeth had created something beautiful out of the ashes of her broken heart. A new life filled with love, laughter, and the joy of watching her children grow. The future wasn't the one she had planned, but it was one she had built with her own strength, and for that, she was proud. It was an ordinary afternoon when everything changed. Elizabeth was at the park with the triplets, watching as they played on the swings, their laughter filling the air. It was one of those moments where life felt simple and happy, and she allowed herself to relax, taking in the sight of her children, their energy endless. But then, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the playground, his presence striking her like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. It couldn't be him. Not here. Not now. But as the figure moved closer, her heart pounded in recognition. David. He was standing there watching her, just as stunned as she was. He hadn't changed much since the last time she saw him. Still tall, still with that same confident air about him, but there was something different, something heavier in his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. Elizabeth's mind raced, trying to process his sudden appearance. After all these years, After everything he had done, he was here, in front of her. The disbelief quickly turned to anger, and her hands clenched into fists as memories of her abandoned wedding day flashed through her mind. She stood up from the park bench, her body rigid with tension. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and cold. The triplets, oblivious to the storm brewing between their mother and the stranger, continued playing, their laughter a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside Elizabeth. David hesitated, his gaze flickering between Elizabeth and the children. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out at first. Then, finally, he found his voice. "I came to see you and them," he said, nodding toward the children. Elizabeth's chest tightened. He meant the triplets. Her protective instincts flared, and she stepped forward, putting herself between David and her children. "You have no right to be here," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "You left us. You don't get to just show up like this." "I know," David replied, his voice low, almost pleading. "I know I hurt you, Elizabeth, but I'm here now. I want to explain." "Explain?" Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh, incredulous. "You abandoned me, David. You left me standing at the altar with no explanation, and now you think you can just walk back into my life because you feel like it?" David's eyes softened with regret, but there was something else there too, determination. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I never stopped loving you. I need you to let me explain why." Elizabeth's heart was racing, a mix of fury and confusion. Her mind screamed at her to walk away, to protect herself and her children from the man who had shattered her life. But there was a small part of her, buried deep beneath the anger, that needed to hear what he had to say. Against her better judgment, she gave him a single nod. "You have 5 minutes," she said, her voice cold. David took a deep breath, his eyes briefly shifting away from Elizabeth as he gathered his thoughts. The tension between them was palpable, but she could see the strain in his face. Something was weighing heavily on him. Despite her anger, a sliver of curiosity tugged at her. Why had he left? What could possibly explain abandoning her at the altar? "When I left you that day," David began, his voice quiet but steady, "it wasn't because I didn't love you. I loved you more than anything, Elizabeth. I still do." He hesitated, searching her face for any sign of understanding, but her expression remained cold and guarded. "That morning, I got a call from my doctor, a call that changed everything." Elizabeth blinked, her anger momentarily giving way to confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. David's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I had some tests done a few weeks before the wedding. I hadn't told you because I thought it was nothing, just routine checkups. But the results came back that morning. I was diagnosed with Huntington's disease." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Huntington's disease. She had heard of it, an incurable, hereditary condition that gradually deteriorated the brain's ability to function, leading to physical and mental decline. It was devastating, and it often ran in families. She could hardly process what David was saying. He continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctor told me that it's a degenerative disease, and that eventually, it would start affecting my body and mind. I could be fine for years, or it could start showing symptoms sooner than expected. And there's a 50% chance that I could pass it on to any children we might have." Elizabeth felt like the ground had fallen out from beneath her. "You left because of that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David nodded, his expression pained. "I was terrified, Elizabeth. Not just for me, but for you. I didn't want to saddle you with a future of taking care of me, watching me deteriorate. And the thought that our children, if we had any, could inherit this. I couldn't do that to you. I thought leaving was the only way to protect you from all of it." Elizabeth's mind reeled. She had spent years trying to understand why David had walked away, never imagining that it was something like this. But even as sympathy began to creep in, so did her anger. "You thought running away would protect me?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You didn't even give me a choice. You left me to face everything alone, and now you're back because what? Now you've changed your mind?" David winced at her words. "I know I handled it wrong. I was scared, but when I found out you had the triplets, I realized I couldn't stay away any longer. I want to be part of their lives, Elizabeth. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to absorb everything he was telling her. He had been running from his illness, from the fear of what it would mean for their future. But in doing so, he had abandoned her at the worst possible time, leaving her to raise 3 children on her own. And now, after all these years, he wanted to come back into their lives? "What about them?" she asked, her voice tight. "What if they inherited it?" David's face crumpled with grief. "I don't know. That's the hardest part. There's no way to tell until they're older. But I want to be here for them, for as long as I can. I can't undo the past, but I can try to be their father now." Elizabeth's emotions warred inside her: anger, sadness, sympathy, and the aching desire for closure. She had no idea how to feel or what to do next. But one thing was clear: her life and her children's lives had just become infinitely more complicated. The days following David's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Elizabeth. She had thought the worst part of her relationship with David was behind her, but now she faced an entirely new reality. The man she had once loved, who had abandoned her without explanation, was back, pleading for a second chance to be part of their children's lives. And worse, he was bringing with him a terrifying uncertainty about the triplets' health and future. Elizabeth couldn't shake the anger she felt. For years, she had been the one to wake up in the middle of the night to feed 3 babies. She had been the one to comfort them when they were sick, the one to celebrate their first steps and words, the one who built a life from the wreckage David had left behind. And now, after all that time, he wanted to waltz back in and claim a place in their lives? But as much as her anger simmered, there was another feeling she couldn't ignore: the tug of sympathy. David's explanation weighed heavily on her mind. The fear of Huntington's disease was real, and she could see how it had paralyzed him with dread. He had believed he was protecting her by leaving, and though his actions were cowardly, Elizabeth couldn't deny the pain in his voice when he spoke of his illness. Still, her primary concern was her children. If there was even the smallest chance they could inherit Huntington's disease, Elizabeth had to protect them. But did protecting them mean keeping David away, or allowing him into their lives, knowing that his time might be limited? It wasn't long before things escalated. David had made it clear that he wasn't going to give up. He had already reached out to a lawyer, pushing for shared custody of the triplets. When Elizabeth found out, it felt like a betrayal all over again. How could he think he had any right to their children after disappearing for so long? The legal papers arrived a week later, and with them, a knot of anxiety twisted in Elizabeth's chest. The idea of a custody battle terrified her. Not only was it a potential disruption to the stable life she had worked so hard to build, but it also forced her to confront the fact that, no matter how much she wanted to shut David out, he was still their father. The courts would take that into account, and David's wealth and resources could easily tip things in his favor. As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself torn between her desire to protect the triplets and the gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, David deserved another chance. Her lawyer warned her that a drawn-out custody fight could get ugly, and the stress would undoubtedly affect the children. But Elizabeth was determined not to let David back in so easily, not after everything he had put them through. Despite the legal tension, David persisted in his efforts to see the children. He made arrangements to meet them under supervision, wanting to build a relationship before the courts made any decisions. Elizabeth reluctantly agreed, but the first meeting filled her with dread. How would the triplets react to the father they had never known? As David walked into the room, Elizabeth stood back, arms crossed, watching every move. The children, curious but cautious, eyed him with wide eyes. There was a moment of awkwardness, but then David knelt down to their level, his voice soft and gentle as he introduced himself. "I'm your dad," he said, and though it was a simple sentence, the weight of it hit Elizabeth like a ton of bricks. She could see the flicker of connection between David and the children, especially in the way Emma shyly smiled at him. Noah and Lucas hung back, but their curiosity was undeniable. Watching them together stirred something in Elizabeth, an emotion she wasn't ready to confront. Could she deny them the chance to know their father, even if it meant opening the door to more pain? The first meeting between David and the children was cautious, but over time, it became clear that a connection was beginning to form. Elizabeth had hoped that the triplets would remain distant, making it easier for her to push David out of their lives once again. But much to her dismay, they were curious about him, especially Emma, whose quiet nature hid a deep desire to understand who her father was. David visited regularly now, always under Elizabeth's watchful eye. The children seemed to grow more comfortable around him with each passing day. Noah, the most outgoing of the three, warmed up to David faster than his siblings. He would ask endless questions about David's life, and David, to his credit, patiently answered everyone. Lucas, more reserved, observed from a distance, occasionally joining in with his brother's questions but still holding back, as if unsure whether to trust the man who had been absent for so long. It was Emma, though, who had the most profound impact on Elizabeth's emotions. One afternoon, after David had left, Elizabeth overheard Emma talking to her brothers. "Do you think Daddy will come back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Elizabeth's heart clenched at the word Daddy. For so long she had filled both parental roles, and now David was creeping into that sacred space. She didn't know how to feel about it. Part of her wanted to protect the children from any future disappointment, while another part couldn't deny that they were building something genuine with their father. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth noticed changes in the triplets' behavior. They seemed happier, more curious about their father's world, asking questions about his past, his family, and why he hadn't been around before. It was painful, but Elizabeth realized she couldn't shelter them from the truth forever. The more they connected with David, the harder it became for her to justify keeping him away. Despite her fears, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice David's sincerity. He was trying, really trying, to make up for lost time. There was a gentleness in the way he interacted with the triplets, a quiet patience that reminded Elizabeth of the man she had once loved. But no matter how well things seemed to be going, she couldn't shake the lingering doubts. Could she trust David again? And more importantly, could she allow him back into their lives without risking more heartbreak? Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the legal documents in front of her. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound cutting through the stillness. The children were fast asleep upstairs, their laughter from earlier that evening still echoing in her mind. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, but Elizabeth's thoughts were anything but. The custody agreement lay before her, staring back with cold finality. In black and white, it laid out the terms that would allow David to share custody of the triplets. The man who had once shattered her world was now asking for a place in their children's lives. It wasn't an easy decision, and Elizabeth's heart weighed heavy with the responsibility of protecting them, even if it meant letting David in. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly. So much had changed over the past few weeks, yet she still wasn't sure if she was making the right choice. Could she really trust David? Could she trust that he would stay, that he wouldn't abandon them again when things got hard? A soft knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. David had asked to speak with her after the children were in bed, and though she had agreed, the anxiety of facing him one last time before finalizing the agreement had gnawed at her all evening. She opened the door, and there he stood, the familiar weariness etched into his features. There was no denying it, David had changed. He wasn't the confident, carefree man she had once known. There was a depth to him now, a heaviness in his eyes that spoke of regret, of fear, of the ticking clock of his illness that loomed over everything. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low, almost cautious. Elizabeth nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The silence stretched between them as he took a seat at the table across from her. His eyes fell to the papers on the table, but he didn't reach for them. Instead, he looked up at her, his expression earnest. "I know I've said this before," David began, his voice filled with emotion, "but I need you to understand how much I regret leaving you. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting you from what's happening to me. But I was wrong. I hurt you. And I hurt the children before I even knew they existed." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. This conversation, these apologies, she had heard them before, and each time, they chipped away at her anger but left behind a hollow ache. She wasn't sure if his words were enough to fix what had been broken. "I know you regret it, David," she said quietly, "but regret doesn't undo what's been done." I had to raise them on my own. I was there for every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every question about why they didn't have a father. And now you're here, and they're starting to love you." Her voice caught, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "I can't take that away from them. But I need to know that you're not going to hurt them the way you hurt me." David's eyes softened with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I won't leave them, Elizabeth. I know I don't have forever, but for however long I'm here, I'm going to be their father. I promise you that." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. She had fought so hard to keep her children safe, to protect them from the pain of David's abandonment. But now, seeing the way they had begun to bond with him, the joy in their eyes when they talked about their father, she knew she couldn't stand in the way of that. They deserved the chance to know him for as long as they could. With a deep breath, she picked up the pen again and, with one swift stroke, signed her name at the bottom of the custody agreement. "I'm doing this for them," she said softly, looking up at David. "Not for you. They deserve to have a father, even if it's only for a short time. But if you hurt them again, if you disappear—" "I won't," David interrupted, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I swear to you I won't." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the decision settling over them both. It wasn't an easy resolution, and Elizabeth knew that the future would be filled with uncertainty. The specter of Huntington's disease hung over them, an ever-present reminder of the fragility of the time David had left with their children. But for now, they had found some semblance of peace, an imperfect, bittersweet peace, but peace nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, the new arrangement slowly took shape. The children spent more time with David, their bond deepening with each visit. Elizabeth watched as they laughed together, as David taught them little things about life, as they grew more comfortable in his presence. It was painful to watch, knowing that this happiness could be fleeting, but it also gave her a sense of hope. A fragile hope, but hope all the same. David's illness would progress, that much was certain. But for now, he was their father and they had a family. A fractured, complicated family, but a family nonetheless. And in the end, that was enough.